Hello, class. Last time we were together, we were talking about the contributions of free blacks, and then right after that, women in ministry, with a focus on Isabella Bonfrey, Sojourner Truth. Today, our lecture is entitled "The Divine Call to Resistance: Black Angels and White Angels." That Black Angels, White Angels part comes from just, I guess, paying tribute to Nat Turner, one of the people that we're going to talk about today, who led a revolt of the enslaved in their enslavement. After he was captured, folk asked him what possessed him, what led him to do it, and he shared a vision that he had. He said a vision that he had from God, where he was in the middle of the fields and he saw blood dripping on the fields. He looked up and he saw black angels battling white angels, and this was uh, the vision that he said inspired him to do what he did, to organize a revolt, to try to free his people from enslavement. But the divine call to resistance, when we're talking about the history of the black church, the divine call to resistance is something that is always present. That people who were resisting enslavement were doing so not because it was a political issue, or not simply because it was a socio-economic issue, but to them it was a religious issue. It was a spiritual matter. Um, they did not believe themselves to be honoring their God if they were accepting second-class citizenship. And so, in many of their minds, God wanted them to be free, and God would work with them to do so. So we're just going to talk about some of those movements throughout history. We're going to get to the topic of black liberation theology, and I'm going to try to be expedient with this and not just talk too long. But like I said, always, when African people were enslaved, there was always resistance from Jump Street, and it never stopped. Always resistance. You would not know that if you just relied on the way black folks' story is taught in this country, but there was always resistance. One group or one element of this resistance was a group known as the Maroons. And the Maroons existed all over, wherever there were African people who were enslaved, there were Maroon communities. Some of the most famous were in Jamaica. Several books have been written about the Maroons. This is just one of them, the Maroons of Jamaica. But they were everywhere. They were in Jamaica, Honduras, Belize, Guatemala, Mexico, Suriname, Brazil, Haiti. In Brazil, the communities that were set up, they were called quilombos. The most famous was called Palmares, or Palm Nation. Palms being a symbol of liberation. In fact, there's the story in the Bible where Jesus is making his triumphal entry into Jerusalem, and the people are throwing palm branches in front of him as he is riding into Jerusalem on the back of a donkey. Palms have always been a symbol of liberation, of a willingness of a people to stand up and fight for their freedom. So it's just quite interesting that as Jesus is riding into Jerusalem, the people see this as a liberating moment. But that's a whole another sermon. But like I said, the Maroons were everywhere, Brazil, Haiti, and they were in North America. Maroon communities were escaped, folk who were enslaved that escaped. And they would set up their own communities in the forests, in the swamps. Some Maroon communities, they would set up a style of life that was more reflective of what they knew from their African roots, and they focused and tended to just stay within themselves so that they could remain free. Um, so they were kind of confined communities. Other Maroon communities were way more active, and they would send out teams of liberators to local plantations anywhere within, I guess, walking distance, and would raid those plantations and seek to free um, other enslaved Africans. Um, the Maroon communities in the United States, a lot of them in Georgia, South Carolina, Florida. A lot of the Maroons connected with uh, different Native American groups here in the United States. Um, the Black Seminoles, many people may have heard something about, where escaped enslaved Africans um, teamed up with the Seminole Indians, and they lived together, and that's a whole different history. Marcus Mosiah Garvey, um, who I consider one of the greatest leaders in African American history. Um, it is said that his parents or his family lineage are traced back to the Maroon communities of Jamaica. Um, but those communities, again, you're talking about African people who escaped their enslavement, led not simply by a socioeconomic or political reasoning, but spiritual and religious reasoning. Their God did not want them to be enslaved, and so they could not honor their God if they continued to accept their enslavement. So Maroon communities are something that should be celebrated, researched, and learned about. All right. Um, in terms of this whole divine call to resistance, when we're talking about black folk in this country that are enslaved, um, throw out a few names at you. Um, Denmark Vesey, who we've talked about already, but I'll bring him up again. Denmark Vesey led a revolt originally scheduled to take place July 14th, 1822. July 14th stands out because that was the date that my parents got married, July 14th. Not in 1822, but anyway. But Denmark Vesey, a very religious man, um, bought his freedom, but he remained very, very active in the life of those who were enslaved. He was a Bible class instructor, and he really focused on the Old Testament and tried to organize people around this notion that God does not want us to be enslaved. And so the Old Testament stories, especially the one of God telling Moses to go tell Pharaoh, let my people go, that's one of his favorite stories. And so it was always messages from the Bible about God working with those who were enslaved or oppressed, and God hearing their cries and either sending them a liberator or doing some other acts to support their efforts to find freedom. So this notion that freedom from bondage was a religious issue and a religious obligation, it goes way back. So you have Gabriel Prosser, you have Denmark Vesey, but you also have Gabriel Prosser, who is known as the Black Samson. Gabriel Prosser, he, just like David Walker, led a revolt of the enslaved. Actually, his took place before Denmark Vesey's. But he was known as the Black Samson because that whole Samson story was his favorite story. He was an extremely religious man, but the notion that, and he was also considered big and strong. So for all those reasons, they called him the Black Samson, which, I don't know if I've said this before in videos, is like calling Michael Jordan the Black Michael Jordan. But again, that's another lecture. Gabriel Prosser tried to organize a revolt of the enslaved, and the same thing that happened to Denmark Vesey happened to him. Brothers told Massa about what was going down, and they were caught and captured really before the thing even got started. But the thing to remember about Denmark and about Gabriel, they were both inspired by their religious beliefs and their religious convictions. It was this divine call to resistance, divine call to fight against whatever was standing between them and being fully actualized as free, self-determining human beings. Another person I want to mention is David Walker. David Walker was an abolitionist. He was born of a free mother and a father who was enslaved in North Carolina. Learned to read and write at a young age. Did most of his work in Boston. That's where he lived. He owned a resale shop in Boston, and he became part of the abolitionist movement. A group of people, black and white, who spoke out against the ills of the institution of slavery. But they believed in working within the confines of the law. We're going to work within the confines of the law. But over time, David Walker grew tired of that approach because it didn't seem to be moving anywhere and producing any different results. And so David Walker wrote what is commonly known as David Walker's Appeal. The actual book has a much longer title, but in that appeal, he moves away from the abolitionist approach of, yeah, we're going to fight to end slavery, but we're going to do it within the confines of the law. He moves from that to a position of basically by any means necessary, that God determines and demands that you be free. God created you to be free, and it is well within your rights to do whatever is necessary to get that freedom. And so that's what David Walker's book was about. It was broken up into four different sections, basically four different arguments for why black people have the right to work for their freedom by any means necessary. One of the sections of the book deals with, it's entitled, "Of the Wretchedness of the Preachers of the Gospel of Jesus Christ." And in it, he goes in hard on ministers who were teaching black people to accept their lot in life, that they were created to be enslaved, and that they should accept that life is a vale of tears, and that you will receive your reward in heaven after you die. And David Walker, who was a devout Christian, but he was very, very critical of ministers who were preaching that particular message, the same message that the enslaved had been getting from day one since they set foot in white churches. Highly critical of those churches and highly critical of those ministers. And he was saying that is one of the reasons why African people had not as a whole stood up and done whatever they needed to do to find their freedom. But the book was a call to action to black people. And just a few other things about David Walker. Like I said, he owned a resale shop in Boston, and he used his business to spread his message. His book was it was illegal to own. If you were caught with David Walker's Appeal, you could be arrested, beaten, tortured, jailed, murdered, or all of the above, some mixture of all the above. There were threats on David Walker's life. His homeboys told him, you need to get the heck out of Dodge, you need to go hide somewhere. He refused to do that. The authorities were trying to confiscate all the books and not trying to make sure that more black folk, more enslaved Africans, were not reading this material and getting all riled up. However, the word got out because David Walker used his business. He had a resale shop in Boston, Boston being a seaport. He would recruit sailors, black and white, who were interested in seeing a different society. And David Walker would sow into the sides of the coats that he was reselling. And he would say, look, okay, so when you leave this port, when you get down to Savannah or whatever southern port they were going to, make sure you get these books to so-and-so. Walker had this network of black and white ministers and other people in those areas who were willing to put their lives on the line to pass out David Walker's appeal. And so, in spite of all the efforts of authorities to stop the spread of that particular book, it got everywhere. But David Walker is to be celebrated. One person or movement I forgot to mention was Toussaint Louverture. In the late 1790s and early 1800s, Toussaint Louverture and the people of Haiti led the first successful revolt of the enslaved, and they actually won their freedom. And when they did so, it scared the hell out of everyone that was in the quote-unquote slave-holding world. They did not want that victory to inspire other enslaved Africans in the United States and other places to mimic what Toussaint Louverture and the Haitians did. But it did inspire them. But even had he not been successful, like I had said before, revolts were always taking place. Some big, some small groups, and some were just individual acts of resistance. Like the sister who's cooking the meals for Massa, grinding up glass and putting it in his food, and he eats it and he slowly dies of a stomach ulcer within weeks or months. Just little things like that, or work slowdowns where the enslaved would purposely break tools, just anything to resist enslavement. But just getting back to David Walker, there was so much of David Walker's appeal that spoke to religion and spoke to God's call for enslaved Africans to fight for freedom. Again, it's this divine call, divine call, divine call. I keep going back to that. Toussaint, Gabriel Prosser, Denmark Vesey, the Maroons, David Walker, on and on and on. You're getting this message that God does not want you to accept this particular situation, even though the message that was being taught in the churches that black folk were going to was slave, be obedient to your master. This is what God created you to be. And so we were hearing it, but we are not fully accepting it, not in the least. Nat Turner, that mentioned earlier, his revolt happened in 1831. As a child, his parents believed that he was destined to do something great, to be a leader for his people. He grew up, he became a minister, he was respected by blacks and whites alike in his part of the world. And many of these things that I'm talking about, David Walker, Gabriel Prosser, Nat Turner, happened in the Northampton and Southampton, Virginia area, all in the same area. But yeah, like I was saying, Nat Turner was a respected minister by blacks and whites alike, and he believed that he was ordained to do something great for his people, and he would receive visions according to his own testimony. And like I said, the vision that we talked about when this video began, when he looked up, he saw this image of black angels, white angels. He took that as God telling him, now is the time for you to stand up and fight against the enslavement of your people. And so he led a revolt, and his plan was to go from plantation to plantation, kill Massa and whoever else, and free all the enslaved, and their army would grow and grow and grow. That was the plan, but it only grew to 75 because not everybody on those plantations where Nat Turner and his crew went and literally killed the owners of the enslaved, not everybody wanted to go. Not everyone wanted to take that chance. And so a troop troops were sent in to capture him and put his movement down. Over 3,000 state militia in Virginia were called out to put down this rebellion of 75 people. Some were captured immediately, others, like Nat Turner, were captured weeks later, jailed, and then he was interviewed, like, why on earth would you do such a thing? Because it was a very popular idea that any enslaved African who sought their freedom, sought to run away, had to be mentally challenged. In fact, there was a medical term, and I'm forgetting what it is right now, but there was a medical term that was devised to describe drapetomania. I think that's it. A medical term that was used to describe the mental illness that was affecting some blacks that would make them leave their station in life, where they were created to be, where they could find happiness and fulfillment as slaves to someone else. How on earth, anything that would make them want to leave that, they had to be mentally insane to want freedom when they could have slavery. But yeah, Nat Turner, folk wanted to know why. What led you to this? What manner of mental illness made you do this? And he said, look, God called me to do this. God does not want my people to be enslaved. So over and over and over and over again, you're talking about this divine call to resistance. I think I'm going to cut it off right here, and in the next video we'll talk about how that divine call to resistance, this kind of ancient old-timey divine call to resistance, is still alive and well in certain areas under the banner of Black liberation theology. So that's it for this video.